And the first perspective around the cycle of excellence is to realize that you don't add value in the urgency, you add value in the importance. So the more that you can elevate your focus to concentrate on those things that are important but not necessarily urgent, using that wonderful Eisenhower matrix, that's where you add value as a leader.
Hi, folks. On this week's episode of the Leadership Foundry podcast, we're going to be talking about the self-evolved leader. So I'm your host for this show this week. I'm Brandon Smith. I'm one of the co-founders of the Leadership Foundry. And to help us on this journey of what does it mean to be a self-evolved leader, we've got Dave McKeown. And Dave is the CEO of Outfield Leadership and the author of The Self-Evolved Leader, Elevate Your Focus and Develop Your People in a World That Refuses to Slow Down, which we can all relate to. So I want you to pay attention to my conversation with Dave. He highlights some really important distinctions between the historic style of leadership and how it was more of a heroic style of jump in and kind of throw on our capes and rescue the day, and how it really isn't effective going forward. And it's a perpetuating cycle of ineffectiveness. He calls it mediocrity. And then the pivots on how we can become this new self-evolved leader. So at the end of the show, as we always do on the Leadership Foundry podcast, I will share with you my notes and highlights so you can take those away in a practical way to help you become a better leader today.
Welding together practical insights and powerful conversations to forge world-class leaders. This is the Leadership Foundry podcast.
Dave, really excited to have you on the Leadership Foundry podcast today. Really excited about this concept you've come up with, the self-evolved leader and self-evolved leadership. I can't wait to dig into that and really get your perspectives on what that means and why that's so important today. But before we do that, for the listeners that maybe aren't as familiar with your work, share a little bit more about who you are, what you do today, and even more importantly, what got you here?
Well, thanks for having me, Brandon. I'm super excited to do the return leg of this conversation. We had a great conversation a couple of weeks ago whenever you were on my show. So excited to be here with you. I've spent probably the last 12 years or so working with leaders and leadership teams to help them scale their impact, ultimately to help them move away from getting sucked into the false urgency of the day-to-day and the chaos and the crisis that seem to be bubbling up around us, to move to a more intentional, scalable way of leading. And I started my career many years ago working for Accenture, big IT consulting company, and realized and discovered at that point that it was the human side of leadership that really attracted me to it. That was the bit that was really interesting. And I moved over to the United States. I'm from Ireland originally, moved over to the United States in 2013, first of all to Massachusetts. I lasted one New England winter before I realized that I couldn't handle the snow. And I now live in Southern California. Just enjoy the sunshine out here.
Yeah, that's great. Excellent. Well, so you kind of made this pivot and journey in your career, really focusing on leadership and the human side of the world. And then eventually, at some point, you came up with this idea of the self-evolved leader and self-evolved leadership. So walk us through that journey. What really was the pivot that made you realize there was a better way or a new way? And then we can start to talk about what it means to be a self-evolved leader.
It's been an interesting journey over the last 10 years as I've seen how the concept of effective leadership has changed and evolved. And the thing that I would hear again and again, where some of these older models for what it means to be a successful leader that are all grounded in certainty, surety, and leading from the front, and even leading through acts of heroism. You know, if you think through the spheres of our world where we draw our role models for leadership, it usually comes from these overly visionary tech leaders, from sports heroes that are constantly stealing victory from the jaws of defeat, and from our obsession with comic heroes and movie heroes. And you talk to people about what they think good leaders are, and they usually pull from those examples. The reality is, though, that those examples are awful in translating to the everyday world that we live, and that if for most leaders, if we lead with this notion of I've got to either be so over visionary, shoot for the fences or swing for the fences, I've got to be overly heroic, I'm constantly saving the day. It's actually a really terrible way to lead. Because you make yourself the center of the story. You're not developing the people underneath you. You might be getting some results on a short-term basis, but it's not sustainable over the long term, and it's certainly not scalable. The impact that you can have throughout the course of your career is greatly diminished. And so as I was working with leaders and leadership teams on not just how to scale their organization, but how to scale their impact as individual leaders, I began to realize that those old models of leadership are failing us. That's not what we need. It's not enough just to achieve results through your own sheer effort. You've got to actually spend more of your time thinking about the medium and long-term direction of your team and the development of your people, which really at its core is what a self-evolved leader is. It's somebody who recognizes that in order for me to succeed, it's not enough just to get the goals, not enough just to get the check marks up on the board if my people aren't growing and developing.
I love that, Dave. That's beautiful. So two things came to mind as you were talking. First, I also think the old school form of leadership is pretty darn lonely. I mean, it's just all about you, and you call it's just, and you think about those superhero movies, they're usually all by themselves. You know, it's not like they've got whole families, and sometimes they team together, but then they immediately go apart and they do their thing. They go back to doing things by themselves. But the second thing that I was thinking of as you were talking about this, I did a workshop. This was pre-pandemic, and it was with a group of leaders talking about executive presence. And they shared this analogy with me. They said, they used basketball as the analogy. They said, what gets you promoted into those leadership roles, those executive roles, is scoring lots of points a night. Drop 45 points a game. That's what gets you in there. But that's not executive presence. He says, what executive presence is a combination of points and assists. You got to learn how to pass the ball so other people can score too. So it's more like 35 points a night, 15 assists, which, as you were talking, made me think, gosh, that's kind of what Dave's, saying. I think he's saying it's about bringing other people together, doing it as a team, and not having it all be on you all the time. Am I kind of in the right direction on that?
Yeah, very much so. I would actually say it's almost all about assists, and actually that those leaders, to take the analogy, let's stretch the analogy as far as we can go, but those leaders that are truly successful in an organizational setting are hitting a couple of points a night, but their assists are all over the board. Like they are the one that are unleashing everybody into their best roles. It's much more of a playmaker role in that perspective. But yeah, I think that the analogy holds in that regard for sure.
Okay. All right. Well, okay. So you've sold me. I love this concept. I think this is where we need to go as leaders. So my natural next question is, where do we start, my friend? What's the starting place on this? If I'm an old school leader or really haven't, maybe a better way to put this is I haven't quite defined my leadership style yet. Right. And I really want to become this self-evolved leader. Where do we start?
Well, let me start just a little bit before we start, because I may have convinced you, but I may not have convinced everybody else on the call. So let me just layer out one more thing just to see if folks can place themselves within this.
Okay, I'm with you.
How I specifically see it often play out, this notion of the heroic leader ends up trapped in a cycle of mediocrity, where they and their team are not necessarily doing bad work, but they're not doing the best work that they can do. And the cycle of mediocrity goes like this. We live in a world where everything is urgent, where everything is required of us yesterday, where anybody can interrupt us at any time and assign whatever priority they want to it. What that does is it actually, if you're prone to leading through acts of heroism, it forces you more in that direction. I'm just going to respond. I'll deal with it. It's faster, easier, better, stronger for me just to deal with it. So somebody on your team comes to you with an issue or a challenge, you either just tell them what to do or you say, hey, don't worry about it. I've got it. It's just this constant being stuck in the weeds in the trenches. What that does is over time, it starts to build a sense of learned helplessness in your team where they're saying, well, if the boss is just going to do this for me, I'm just going to stop thinking for myself. There's no point. I'll just literally go and say, hey, problem, what do you want me to do? Or do you want to do it? And it becomes very transactional. which over time leads to massive disempowerment for them and frustration and overwhelm for you because you're taking on more, which then amplifies the urgency and you get caught in this ongoing cycle. It's not that you can't deliver good work, and there may be flashes of good work, but for the most part, you're all just sort of stuck in this cycle of mediocrity where it just feels a bit meh. If you think that if you recognize yourself in that cycle, then you're definitely going to benefit from transitioning towards a cycle of excellence. And the first perspective around the cycle of excellence is to realize that you don't add value in the urgency, you add value in the importance. So the more that you can elevate your focus to concentrate on those things that are important but not necessarily urgent, using that wonderful Eisenhower matrix, that's where you add value as a leader. We have convinced ourselves and told ourselves over time that we add value in the urgency bit. We help solve problems. We help get out of crises. We're in there with our team, and we have a tendency to turn everything into a crisis. In fact, some leaders literally go out looking for crises every day. Here's the interesting thing about it. Solving crisis in and of itself is an ego booster. It's got great rewards and it keeps you caught in that cycle because you solve a problem on a daily basis. You go put out a fire or solve a crisis. You get to go home at the end of the day. You feel wanted, helpful, valuable, useful, and needed. It gives us an endorphin rush. And it's those rewards that keep us stuck in that cycle. Whereas if you're focusing on the truly important stuff, the medium and long-term direction of your team and the development of your people, that's a much longer reward cycle. And the payoff is way down the line. It might be next quarter, it might be next year before you really start to see the benefits. But you got to make that transition. So if you want to get out of the cycle of mediocrity, you got to realize the value that I add is in the important, not the urgent. What you then do is you start finding ways to build shared goals with your team, building shared accountability so that you're not the hero that's jumping in to save the day. Shared accountability. That then leads to development and growth for your team, which leads to greater satisfaction, engagement, employee morale, growth and development, all that good stuff. And you get to focus on the next thing, the next big meaty thing that's coming down the pipe. You get to focus on the important stuff. So two contrasting circles: cycle of mediocrity, cycle of importance. If you find yourself, pardon me, not everybody gets caught in one cycle at all times, and often we can kind of flip through them depending on the day, the context, what's in front of us. But if you want to spend more time in this cycle of excellence and less time in the cycle of mediocrity, that's where I can come and start to answer your question, which is, what do we do?
Okay, so amen, brother, on everything you said. One thing I would want to emphasize is most people listening to this live in a context or workplace culture that is a cycle of mediocrity. That's the gravity, right? So you've got to fight that gravitational pull and somehow break through the atmosphere. Or more simply put, you got to tell folks no. I'm not, your urgent's not my urgent. I've got a whole list of things that are important. That is where I really want to add value. And I find so many people really struggle with that because they're afraid what's going to happen to them if they push back. So they just take on more of the urgent things and they end up continuing in that cycle you just described. Yeah. So what advice can you give us on how we can do a better job of forcing prioritization or pushing back or saying no or anything else so we can keep that, the bubble we're trying to put around our team, which is the image that I'm seeing in my mind as you're talking, we're trying to create this shared accountability, shared goals, this bubble. How do we keep that protected?
And it's a dynamic that happens all the time, and I get pushback often whenever I talk about this. And my response is usually twofold. The first thing is to say, well, when was the last time you actually tested that assumption? Because quite often we come with these beliefs. Well, I couldn't do it. That'd never fly. Or my boss is going to do this or the other. Fine. When was the last time you actually tested that assumption? And the answer is usually, well, not really pretty recently, to be honest. It's been quite a while. So I always encourage people to push at the boundaries of what they believe their sandbox to be, because you may get a little further. And then the second thing is to understand, once you've done that, yeah, we operate in a world where we have control over what we can do, but there are certain things that we can't control. If you can get really good at managing this a little bit with your team, you'll actually start to realize that folks around you will look at you differently and wonder why it is that you feel like, why it seems like you're able to rise above the urgency, and actually you can then start to influence a little bit beyond your own little circle that you're in. You might not ever get complete, buy into the transformation that we're talking about here, but you can create little pockets for yourself. And then the third thing I usually say is, look, if it really comes down to it and there's no way for you to make that shift and you really want to do it, then why are you in the role that you're in? There are other organizations, there are other places that will afford you a little bit more flexibility. Like, why, if you really, really don't like that and you know that you want to move towards a cycle of excellence, like go find another option, go find somewhere else where you might be able to do that.
Yeah. That's great. So the other thing you were mentioning, I love this picture of shared goals and accountability. What does that look like in practice? How do you create that? Because I think it's so easy for either the leader or the other members of the organization to point to that leader and say, no, it's you. You're the one who's accountable for this. How do you kind of create that shared goals and accountability?
Funny enough, it actually comes at the end of a longer process. It's hard to start there because we live in a world where things do move so quickly. And if we need to make the shift, we need to buy everybody a little bit more time. So there are actually some other leadership disciplines that come before you really can get to it, which I'll just share in a real high level overview. First of all, you've got to find a way to manage your own attention, because if you're constantly being pulled in different directions, there's just no way that you're going to be able to pull yourself out of the cycle of mediocrity. Secondly, you've got to find a way to effectively delegate down to your team those things that fall outside of your main area of expertise. So as you look down your to-do list and ask yourself, is there somebody on my team who, with the right advice, guidance, and coaching, could do this? The answer is you should probably find a way to delegate it, particularly if it's an ongoing task. Now, you've got to do that effectively, of course, and make that work. So you manage your own attention, ensure that the work is being facilitated and passed around your team effectively. You've got to support folks towards high performance, which means not lurking over their shoulder and checking in every 5 minutes on how things are going, but getting really clear on what the outcome is and saying to them, I am open to talk through this with you at any point. But this is yours. Like, I believe in you. I know that you can do this, and let's ensure that we meet regularly enough so that you're comfortable, but you got to support high performance in that way. Then you've got to be able to have those difficult conversations when things are not going to plan. You got to be able to help folks course correct. It's only once you've done those four things and you've built a little bit of proficiency in it that you can really start talking about building shared accountability, because they're the foundation of trust that your people need from you, that if they get together and set some shared goals, they know that they're going to be able to take care of it and you're going to be there to support them. If they don't have that belief, then it's really hard to just transition away from you leading through through acts of heroism to you saying, hey, we're all going to create shared goals. But once you get there, the goal as a leader is to ensure that the goals that your team are setting for themselves add up to an overarching goal that your team's working on. They are complementary, not in conflict. Doesn't mean that two people can't have the same goal. Doesn't mean that you can't have two salespeople that are, trying to be the top salesperson for the month. But if salesperson A wins, and by nature of that means that salesperson B has to lose, cannot achieve their goals, that's not where you want to go at all. Your goals have to be complementary. You've got to have a process by which people feel open and free to share their goals. They can't be in the dark, because if they're in the dark, then we're just never going to be able to set and achieve those shared goals. And you've got to have a process by which your team comes together to celebrate the success of individual achievement of your goals and to act as a support group, to act as folks that can carry you through whenever somebody else on the team isn't achieving their goals, so that it doesn't feel like it's this negative exercise. Often what teams get wrong is they come in and they're like, well, we achieved this one and this one, that's great. And we just didn't do this one. And we don't talk about that. We should feel comfortable to come and say, hey, I'm really struggling with this one for this reason or that reason. And for your team to say, hey, well, let me help out, or here, have you thought about this? Or, maybe you want to go in this direction, that we're a support group for one another. And you'll know that you've achieved it when you can take a vacation or a trip or some time off. Your team will actively still want to get together on a weekly or a monthly or a quarterly basis to review their own success as a team, to be there for one another. But again, like I said, you got to build those other disciplines. Otherwise, there's no foundation for it.
Yeah. Well, when you talked about those other disciplines that lead up to that, the theme weaving through all those seems to be intentional use of time. So, you talk about kind of manage your own attention. That's your intentional use of time. Delegate effectively and intentionally, not just jump in and do it. Intentional use of time. Support high performance, which means you've got to make time to sit down and talk to folks and have those conversations. And then create that plan and monitor that. Hopefully I captured all those pretty accurately. So it's all just, you've got to put it on the calendar. And also, before you jump in and say yes to something, really ask yourself, should I be doing this? Or often what I would say to folks is, not I'm trying to be rude when I say this, but I say you want to really honor your hourly rate. You don't want to be the most expensive light bulb changer. That's not a good use of time. I mean, if there's someone else that's really what they're paid to do, you should let them do their job, because there's some things you're paid to do that actually only you can do. So you really want to do those first and not get sucked into doing, other folks' jobs where you become really, really expensive. I tell you a quick story, and then I've got another question for you. I had a client of mine several years ago, and I was trying to get him to shift from kind of away from doing PowerPoints. PowerPoints was a big thing for him. He was doing them. He liked doing his PowerPoints. But he just couldn't get away from doing his own PowerPoints. And he would stay up to 2 a.m. doing his own PowerPoints. And he ended up becoming a pretty senior leader. And two things became true. First, he was the highest paid graphic designer in Atlanta, given his rates. And second, he was the worst graphic designer in Atlanta. So you never want to be the highest paid and the worst. But anyway, coming down to these ideas of managing time, is there an entry point into that? I mean, you did start off with manage your own attention, but is there a way we get a handle on our time that can start to move us down this path of becoming the self-evolved leader?
There is, and I'll share it with you in just a minute. I do want to call out one thing, that it is time, and time is the conduit, but it's also energy and headspace. And if we don't have the time, it's very hard to find ourselves with the right energy and in the right headspace to think creatively, to think about the long term. And we're just constantly it's just like you wake up every day and you're standing in front of a tennis ball machine that's just firing tennis balls at you. You don't actually get to work on any of your swings or your full game. Your only job is to knock the tennis balls back over the net, whatever way that you can. So time, and either through that or with that energy and headspace, but intentionality is the big one for sure. Now, how do we get to that point where we're able to do that? Two things. Number one, you've actually got to go through an exercise where you rebuild or redefine, or for the first time, define the overarching vision of where you want your team to go. What's the world that your team is trying to create for themselves, for the folks in the organization who they serve, or if they have a direct client-facing role, for the customers that they serve. And here's the reason why. If you think about the horizon level that an overarching vision has, it's the only counterpoint, or it's the biggest counterpoint from a gravitational perspective, from the day-to-day runway level actions and tactics. If you're sucked in there, you need something to counter weight you, to pull you out, and setting a shared vision is a really helpful way to get there. The second thing is most teams don't have one. They just rely on whatever the overarching vision of the organization is, which that often is a big leap. It's sort of like, I'm not quite sure how what I do adds up to that. So setting an intermediate gap is really helpful. Building it with your team is even more helpful, because then they're bought into it. It's actually one of the first bits of seeding in of that shared accountability, so that if your team creates this shared vision with you, when it comes to setting goals, if there's a conflict or a discussion, you just go back to the fact that they were in the room when you decided what that overarching vision and purpose of your team was. So start there. And then I'm a big believer in having pre-made buckets. And all I mean by that is just somewhere to hook things that come into your day-to-day life. The reality is, for most leaders, we have no buckets. And so we've got no way to deal with this interruption versus this interruption. We might have a series of meetings that we go into, but there's no horizon on that. There's no timeline associated with that. So it's a very non-sexy exercise to go through, but look at the vision that you've created with your team. Where do you need to be by the end of the year? What's your one overarching goal for the year? What are the 3 to 4 key projects you need to run this quarter to get closer to that? What's your monthly cadence like with your team? Actually just building those buckets so that when something comes into you, you go, oh, we can deal with that at the next monthly meeting. Oh, that's an interesting new strategic initiative we might want to pursue. Let's put that to the quarterly meeting and talk about it then, rather than just feeling like you need to come in every day and just say, well, all of this data and information came to me. Once you got some buckets and you can put things into those buckets, actually starts to give you a little bit of time. You start to realize, okay, if I don't have to respond to everything right then and there and make it a crisis that's got to be tended to, okay, I can take a breath. Now I've got a little bit of room. Now I can figure out how to delegate a little bit more. Now I can really support my team. And it's about that drumbeat, that cadence, that rhythm. I often talk about when you jazz music, the difference between like somebody wanting to be a successful jazz musician. The core of good jazz music is a really good rhythm section, just a constant drum beat, get in there. And you can riff off the top of that, but it's not all riffs. Like if it was just all riffs, it would be noise. And we live in a world where everything's just noise. We're all soloing guitar over the top of everything, rather than like, okay, just get your drum beat down, like get that rhythm of implementation down. And then you can have of heroism, and you can have these massive, incredible feats of daring do on the top of it, but don't make it your de facto way of leading. So set the vision and build your implementation pulse, and then you can start to work on those disciplines.
Yeah, Dave, this is great. So I know we've covered a lot of ground on moving us to becoming a self-evolved leader. Is there anything else that we haven't talked about around this concept or idea that you would want to make sure listeners would not lose or leave this show without hearing?
Yeah, the mindset shift that's required to get there, because at the end of the day, if we're going to shift our behavior in any direction, it's got to be led with the mindset shift. And we teed it up a little bit with the cycle of excellence and mediocrity. But what it boils down to is the self-evolved leader's mantra is, my focus is on helping my team achieve our shared goals, and in doing so, become the best version of themselves. There are 2 parts to that. It's not enough just to say, my job as a leader is to help you achieve your goals, because that leaves a whole load of room for acts of heroism. In doing so, to become the best version of themselves. It's two for one. And you start to think about that. You blend that into every interaction that you have. You put that at the forefront of a mantra for you every day. And actually the rest of it that follows after it can become quite functional. It's not that mysterious, everything that follows that, but that mindset shift is what'll really help get you some momentum in the right direction.
Yeah. And hearing you say that, it completely recasts and changes those one-on-ones.
Right.
Because most leaders have one-on-ones, but you're just firefighting. It's just tasky stuff. There's no real effort and intention on developing the person. It's just, what fires do you have?
Right.
Okay, you're just going to give them to me, and I'm going to either tell you what to do or I'm going to solve it for you. That's
Right.
most leaders one-on-ones.
Right.
And the way you frame it, simple, but just completely changes how those should be done.
Right. For sure. Absolutely. And just saying things like, okay, there's a lot on your plate here. Like, what's your biggest challenge? What are your solutions? What have you thought of? What are you going to go do? Like just putting it back on the other person to do the thinking and then go, that sounds like a really good next step. I'm here to support you. Let me know what you need from me, rather than just saying, oh, we should do that or leave that and I'll fix it. It's a subtle way of showing up, but it revolutionizes how your people grow and develop.
Yeah, amen. Absolutely. Well, Dave, I ask every guest on my show this question. So on the Leadership Foundry podcast here today, what is one practical tip you might have for us on how we can improve our leadership starting tomorrow?
So we talked about some high level disciplines that folks can work on. There are actually a number of what I call micro disciplines, just these little ways of turning up that are really powerful. And the one that I think I'll share now is to lean into the power of the pause and let silence do the heavy lifting. So often we feel as leaders that we're sort of scared of silence, that we've got to fill the vacuum. And that leads us to providing solutions, leads us to jumping in to save the day. So if there's an issue or a challenge or a question, pause. Just pause. Let silence do the heavy lifting, and then maybe fill it with your thoughts once you've heard from some other folks.
I'm practicing, by the way, right there. That was me practicing the pause. So.
That was beautiful. Very well done.
So, Dave, this is great. If people want to follow you, learn more about the work you do, engage in any resources or services you might have to offer, where can they go?
Best place to go is davemckeown.com. You'll find links to all of the work that I do, the keynote speaking, the consulting that I do, the training that I do, to the book. Book's available on Amazon and all good bookstores. I'm reasonably active on LinkedIn. Follow me there. I'm also on Twitter at Dave McKeown, and happy to engage with anybody at any time.
Yeah, Dave, this is great. Really appreciate you coming on the show today. Appreciate all your insights and guidance. I love this framing that you've come up with, the future of leadership. I just think it's so powerful. Keep up the great work, my friend.
Thank you, Brandon. Appreciate you having me.
Wasn't that a great conversation I had with Dave? I really enjoyed it. As a reminder, I'm Brandon Smith. I'm the host of this week's Leadership Foundry podcast and the co-founder of the Leadership Foundry. What I love about Dave's self-evolved leader idea was that it really helps take us from a cycle of mediocrity where we're always the hero and moves us into a position where we're really trying to elevate and develop our team. And those 4 big central starting places there. He said we want to manage our own attention, be aware of what's drawing our attention and focus on the important first. We want to delegate effectively and intentionally to our team. Support high performance by having coaching in those one-on-ones. And then finally, create a plan for our team and their progress and monitor that. And if we do that really well, we're going to elevate our entire team. It's very similar to some of the concepts you've heard me talk about in the past around author versus editor. So I love the conversation. I hope you took away a nugget or two from there on something you can put into your toolkit to help make you a better leader, not only today, but tomorrow.